Oh, I just got a notification. Cool. All right, guys, here we go. I'm still learning how to use Zoom, so bear with me as I do this. Can you guys see?
Yes.
Sweet. All right. I gotta move y'all to a place.
United States of Zift.
All right. The History to Modern Slavery by United States of Zift is what I like to title this piece. All right, so first things first, Keek and Richard, you guys are the only ones I can see. Just feel honored, I guess. I wanted to put out there that I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form on this, but this is just kind of information that I've accumulated either through conversations or reading books and stuff like that. And I think this is like the awesome time to be able to talk about it together, and we can learn together through it. One thing I did want to say right off the bat is I think we can be tempted, maybe just because of how our education is, that we equate our knowledge of Black history as only struggle and oppression, that all the concepts that we tend to learn about Black history are always just like difficult things and slavery and getting out of slavery and all these things. And we will be talking about a lot of the hard parts of Black history today, but I wanted to remind us that that's not the only history that there is in terms of Black people. There's a lot of Black excellence, and there's incredible things that Black people have brought to us. And I know that shouldn't have to be said, but that needs to be clarified, in my opinion, because we need to recognize how we view history. So that being said, we're going to talk about history in this lecture. I guess I feel like there's a lot of conversation happening right now that's so awesome on how can we educate ourselves and what are things to notice and what's going on right now. But I think ultimately we can't really understand what's happening now unless we look at a historical context and see how did it get to this point. In general, I'm basing this off of what I remember learning in high school. So I'm gonna check like throughout to see like, have you heard about this before? If yes, I'll probably just move on because I'm not trying to be repetitive. I didn't put any citations in this because honestly, that would have taken a lot of time. So if there's anything that you guys particularly are looking to be fact checked, just shoot me a text and I can send you the website over like right afterwards. And throw me a chat. I don't really know actually how to check it. Throw me a chat and Kika, unmute yourself and ask a question if someone has a question, and then I can address it then. I think that's it. Oh, at the end, I'm going to give you guys access to this PowerPoint so you can refer to it as much as you need. And at the end of the PowerPoint, there's also a document of a lot of different resources that you can follow up with afterwards. And it's TV, books, everything, whatever you want, it's there. So hopefully that will be helpful for you. There's also going to be some slides in this that I'm not going to cover, and that's intentional. It's more that if you want to read through it afterwards, there's additional information. So don't get stressed if you see some things. Don't worry about it. And then the last thing I'm going to say before I hop into this is that this is going to be overwhelming. And I don't want to say that's the intention, but that's the reality. So if you take anything out of this lecture, is I want everyone to recognize that there is a huge history that explains systemic issues now. And then through time, hopefully, if you feel so passionate, you can go back and just read the details and maybe things will resonate more. But don't get worried if you feel like this is overwhelming. All right, cool, let's start. So slavery happened. I'm assuming all of us know what slavery is. An interesting piece actually is today, something called Juneteenth, like June 19th. And June 19th, for those of you who don't know, is the official day that slavery ended in the States. And it's not the day that the Emancipation Proclamation was made. It's not the official like legal one. It's 2 years after slavery was illegal, but it took 2 years to get to Texas in order for those enslaved people to know. So today's the day, which I think is really fitting for this conversation. So here's your fun fact. Right off the bat, the only thing I want to talk about in terms of the slavery period, because I think we all know about this, is police and how police started actually, which I actually learned this really recently. But the police system started as slave patrols. What they would do is they would just walk around, all think the slaves were behaving, and they're protecting the landowners from their own enslaved people. So their job was to chase down, apprehend, and return enslaved people to their owners. They would provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and they'd maintain a form of discipline. So that was how police started, was to take control of people who are enslaved. Now, the 13th Amendment is a really big part of history. This is the piece of history that legally abolished slavery. But there's a little catch to it that I don't think we ever really talk about it. I'm gonna read it to you now. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. or any place subject to their jurisdiction. What does that mean? that means, okay, slavery's done, y'all, unless you committed a crime. That's what it means. And this is a really big loophole that's going to be really important as we keep talking about it, because it leaves a lot of room. Because what ended up happening, the Civil War ended, and then they made this amendment to end slavery. But during the Civil War, so much damage was caused, physical damage. But the labor force, which were people who were enslaved, no longer legally exists. So who are you going to have build things when your whole labor force is gone? You got to create a new form of slavery. So this clause allowed this to happen. Oh, and if you're interested on the details of the 13th Amendment, there's a really good documentary on Netflix, and it goes through way more detail than I could ever know in my life. So that's a good resource for y'all if you want it. So now you have, all right, slavery's ended, but we need things to go on. So what can the people who were slave patrols, what can they do after the slavery was abolished? So they had two things basically they could do. They could either join vigilante groups, which is why the KKK was established. They were former slave patrols. Once slavery was abolished, the KKK, they switched into that. Or they could enforce something called black codes, which we're going to talk about in a second. But there's this quote that I think really put things into perspective for me, so I'm going to read it for you guys. It says, "The white and wealthy had become accustomed to having a state-sanctioned force to maintain the status quo, so the police became a staple of white comfort." This is important. So black codes. Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of Blacks and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery was abolished. What does that mean? It's basically laws that they created to take advantage of the loophole in the 13th Amendment that we just talked about, so that they can bring people who were enslaved back and get them to work again in a new legal context. So what they would do, they made a lot of petty offenses and laws, and I'm gonna explain a few that are gonna blow your mind. And then the states would then lease out the convicts for labor. So police now, the police officially formed to enforce black codes. And what they would do is they'd drive around, or I don't know, you probably didn't have cars, I don't know. They would look for people who were breaking these black codes. And then when they found someone doing that, they would arrest the black person and they would lease them back to a plantation. Now, something that blows my mind is the same plantations and more that lost slaves got them back through black codes. But at this point, it's almost even worse, because when you were enslaved in a specific spot, even though your landowner boss man was horrible to you, he still had some form of like wanting to keep you alive because you did work for him. Now he doesn't own you. You know what I'm saying? So if you weren't doing well, it doesn't matter to him. You're not his property. I hate these words, but this is how it was thought. So the conditions were actually even worse afterwards, and it became a really big business that would pay, everyone would get money out of it. So it was in everyone's interest except for the black people. So here are two examples of black codes. The first one is something called vagrancy. This basically means if you don't have a job, that's a crime. You can imagine how hard it was to get a job in this time anyways. So for example, in South Carolina, if a parent was considered vagrant, if a parent didn't have a job, maybe there's uncles, maybe there's aunt, giddos, anyone. No, if the parent doesn't have a job, then legally a judicial system can take the kid and have him work in a plantation for an employer, and that employer could do whatever he wanted to the kid. That could be abuse. That's an example. Another example is freedmen, people who were no longer slaves, were not allowed to assemble without a white person present. An example, in LA, it was illegal for a black man to preach to a black congregation without written permission from the president of the police. So basically, black people could have church. These are some examples of black codes. This is what kept on. So black codes eventually paved the way into the Jim Crow laws, which I think we're all pretty familiar. It's the separate but equal and segregation that lasted for so long. I can't do math. 80 years in this country. And the police also, all they did was they just switch names, right? They went from black codes to Jim Crow. So the police went and started enforcing these ones too. Now, a lot of stuff happened during Jim Crow laws, obviously, because it was a long period of time. Something that happened there that I think is so important for us to know, but is unfortunately one of the nastiest parts of our history, in my opinion, is something called the TULSA massacre. So I want you guys just take a look at these pictures, what we're going to talk about in a second, but we need a visualization. You got here like a nice looking place, and then on the right, I couldn't even tell you what that used to be. And these are the same place, and I'm going to explain how this happened. So there's a place in Tulsa's in Oklahoma, called Greenwood. It was a district. And this district at the time, in 1921, was the most prominent black community in the States. It was self-contained, self-sustaining. They had houses, banks, restaurants, churches, like everything. Like it didn't need anything else. And it was affectionately known as Black Wall Street. It was the epitome of Black wealth and success. And then there was a Black kid from this district that went, somewhere in Tulsa, and he got into an elevator, not casually, with a woman who happened to be white, and they just went up 2 floors. When they got out of the elevator, the woman claimed that he assaulted her, and it turned into a very large thing. After this happened, 3,000 KKK members, alongside with police and the National Guard, stormed Greenwood, very angry over this apparent assault. They set it all on fire. They arrested, they killed, they made nothing left. And during this, it was the very first time in American history that American bombs were dropped on American soil. Do you know what that's sick? It's literally America bombing itself is what happened here. And you can see in the picture, there was nothing left. I'm going to get into stats in a second. After all this happened, the Tulsa Commission, the people in charge of Tulsa, made a bunch of random rules and laws that blocked Tulsa's rebuilding. So they took Black Wall Street, knocked it down, and they didn't allow it to come back up. So here's some facts of what happened. They legally 100 to 300 people were killed, but there are some experts, it's hard to tell. There are some experts that say the death toll could match 9/11. And all of these are unmarked graves. We can't even see. 6,000 people were arrested, and they were put in temporary internment camps until after it all settled over. They let them go. But there was nothing left. So 9,000 people were left homeless. And since they couldn't rebuild it, they didn't have a choice but to just leave their homes. 1,200 buildings were destroyed. And after doing the math into what money is valued to now, $50 to $100 million of property damage happened in this time. Any questions so far? Cool. Okay, a little bit switching topic, but also during Jim Crow laws, something that's really important, and we're going to touch on several times in this conversation, called redlining happened. And what redlining is it's a systemic denial of investment and public services in Black and brown neighborhoods. I'm going to explain it real quick, but I want everyone to take a look at these maps and notice how it's shaded in different colors. There's red, and both of those are supposed to be green. So what redlining is in 1934, shortly right after the Great Depression, cities all across the country took to their maps and started zoning out things. And what they did was they made a red line around undesirable areas, which were those where Black and brown residents lived. And then they put a green outline in desirable areas, which is where white businessmen happen to live. So that way they literally put in the map yes and no areas. And what they did was they discouraged and they blocked cities from investing in those red line areas, the areas where Black and brown people lived. And so over time, those areas have no more funding, so they became underfunded and they became deteriorated. And there was a law made that enforced by the police and by banks that mortgage loans were not allowed to be given to Black and brown people who wanted to move to a white neighborhood. So even if you were Black and you wanted to get out of a red zone area, you didn't have the option. Legally, there was no way to do it. And the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration, regulated this. So you find over time, white neighborhoods had public investment, they had better infrastructure, good schools, hospitals, and public spaces. But in the red zoned areas, their social conditions went down. And societally, when social conditions go down, crime increases. And with crime increasing, property values decrease. And so naturally, just because they did this, the red line areas property values decreased. And that still affects us today. And I'm going to talk about that towards the end, about how it still affects us. All right. Around the same time as this as well, I promise I'm naming a few 3 random facts type of thing, but they're all gonna come. I'm gonna give you an outline of how this all led to something greater. Someone named Emmett Till came around, and Emmett Till, in my opinion, is one of the most important people that we should know about in history. He was a 14-year-old boy who lived in Chicago, and he went down to visit his family in Mississippi. He was a very, very cheerful kid. He was hanging out with some of his cousins or friends in Mississippi, and he walked into a convenience store. And on his way out of the convenience store, he said, "Bye, baby," to the white woman that was the cashier or regulating the convenience store. Now, this woman was so offended by the statement. Her husband came back after a few days, and she told him that Emmett grabbed her and was flirting with her and whistling at her and on all of these things. And so the husband and his buddy pulled up. I don't know how they found Emmett. They pulled out to his family's house, They dragged him out of the house and into their car. And this is going to be graphic, but I think it's important for us to know. They took him, they made him carry a 75-pound like ancient fan. They made him walk with that to a river. They forced him to take off his clothes. They beat him nearly to death. They gouged out his eye, and they shot him in the head. And then they tied his body with a barbed wire to that fan that he carried, and they threw him in the water. When his body was found, it was so disfigured that they were not able to identify it except for a ring that had his initials on it that was known to be his. His mom opted for an open casket funeral, and this casket actually is in DC. You can see it in the African American History Museum, so that the world can see what he's done. And Emmett Till changed the history for Black people. So we have a little bit of an outline here of how Emmett Till kind of contributed to history. 6 months before Emmett Till was someone named Claudette Colvin. And who she was a 15-year-old dark-skinned girl who was pregnant. And she did the same thing as Rosa Parks. She refused to stand up on a bus so that a white person can sit down. And this was something that Black leaders at the time, the NAACP was looking for something to start the movement. They were gonna use it as their figurehead to start a movement, but they found that when she was dark-skinned and pregnant out of wedlock, that she wasn't gonna be, by their opinion, a good figurehead for the movement. So they waited. Between then, Selma happened, which I think you guys have probably seen the movie, which is the March to Montgomery to fight voter suppression. 6 months after Claudette was Emmett Till, which is the person we just talked about. 100 days after Emmett Till comes Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks had heard of Claudette Colvin and Emmett Till from the NAACP meeting, and they inspired her, and she refused to stand up for the white man in the bus. And that is what triggered the Montgomery bus boycott, which we know was over a year, and that allowed desegregation eventually of the buses. Martin Luther King was the one who headed the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's what made him the spearhead for the civil rights movement. And then the civil rights movement happened, and Jim Crow and legal voter suppression ended. So you can see we're missing the first part of history, which is the dirty part of history that we hadn't really heard of before. So this is just a nice little picture I made, and then we're gonna take a quick break because I know all of our attention spans are suffering right now living at home. But you've got, this is like as what's it called? Representative visually as I could get. You have the Black codes, then you have Jim Crow laws, and at the same time as Jim Crow laws was redlining, which we talked about, was when they took out certain areas of the map and was like, nope, don't invest in this, and that's where the Black people lived. And you can see where the Tulsa massacre happened and where Emmett Till was killed, and then the civil rights movement, which ended in 1968. So you've got that, and now we've got a little 5-minute break. So I'm going to leave this up here for us to kind of look at, and if you guys need to take a break, go to the bathroom, do your thing, and we'll come back super soon.
Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, are there any questions? Are we doing okay so far? I know it's a lot of information. Good? Cool. All right, let's get back at it. All right, 1 sec. Okay. Now we're about to start getting into things that happened either between our parents' lifetimes or our lifetime. So I know that was a little bit, it feels, what we just talked about can be easy to feel more distance because it's during our grandparents' times or before, but this is stuff that honestly, if our parents lived in America, they'd remember some of this stuff. So this is about to get into it. The first thing that I was debating whether including or not, but honestly, I think is a really important part of our history, and I think enough of us are trying to get into healthcare that it's important. It's something called the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is intense. Brace yourselves. Okay, the Tuskegee syphilis study. So I'm first going to tell you what syphilis is. It's a bacterial infection that is spread either sexually or congenitally, which means basically in the womb from your parents. So it starts as a sore, and right now it's super easy to be treated. You can take penicillin and you're solid. But if it's left for years and years, it can get horrible. Bone decay, heart damage, and blindness, paralysis up until you die. So it's a very slow, painful death. I'm sorry this is graphic for people, but I don't think we should censor history. So something happened with syphilis. They found a group of Black people in Tuskegee, which is in Alabama, and for some reason this group of people, like this community, happened to have a lot of syphilis, and it was determined. Right now it's more commonly passed down sexually, but it was determined in this area that it was 61% of people who had syphilis who actually had received it congenitally, so they had gotten it from their parents. And so a group of researchers decided that we want to study syphilis. And the reason they wanted to study it was because at the time, the way that medicine was framed was they thoroughly believed that Black people were underdeveloped compared to white people, up to including their brains. So it was known in white people, they thought that it was a neurological disease because paralysis and blindness and stuff. They're like, okay, it affects the brain in white people, but how does it affect people since they have underdeveloped brains? They thought it hurt your heart, your cardiology stuff. And at the same time, they also had medicine had really projected this image that Black people were hypersexual and that they couldn't control it. So this is why they had syphilis. So this study came out because they were trying to prove that syphilis was different in white people versus Black people. So they created a study. So researchers found a pool of infected men. And what they did was they advertised everywhere. They were like, hey, do you have, they called it bad blood? Do you have bad blood? Come and we'll give you free treatment. You're gonna be okay, like we got you. They got 400 men with syphilis to sign up, and then they withheld treatment. They refused to help them without telling them. And then they stayed and they wanted to study and see how would syphilis affect their bodies. The men were never told that they were an experiment, and they died really horrific deaths because the system just allowed them. They just wanted to see how syphilis would affect them. Even when, at the time this was started, they had like different things here and there to try to help. During the study, which by the way was granted to happen for only 6 months, and it lasted 40 years, 1972, some of our parents were born at this time. Even though penicillin had come out 10 years into the study as the treatment to help, you're good. They didn't give it to them. They still wanted to see what would happen. And Senator Kennedy was actually made aware of it because someone complained. And they're like, this study isn't doing what it's saying it's doing. He was like, don't worry about it. A-okay. So the Tuskegee syphilis study, this is the most lengthy instance of experimental abuse in Western history. And the reason that I thought to include it was because it's not the only one, but it's the most famous. And for all of us that have a heart, it's the beginning of a huge web of healthcare injustice and how that still affects us today. So this is important to recognize, especially when it comes to, there's a lot of distrust in the medical community within Black communities, and this is one of the reasons. This is a book that I've read, in case you can't tell, that I think anyone, especially anyone interested in healthcare, should read. It gives you the history from the beginning of America up until like today of medical injustices and how medicine was built in Black bodies. So I really recommend this book. It's very intense. I have to like pick it. I still haven't finished it during it, but I really recommend this book. And okay, this is things still existing now. So in 1971, President Nixon declared something called the War on Drugs. And before I start this, I shouldn't have to clarify this, but I think if we're going to talk statistics, we need to talk all aspects of statistics. And it is statistically determined that both then and now, Black people and white people use drugs at the same rates. That's important to recognize because we can't assume one thing versus the other. So the war on drugs. So basically, what happened was after the civil rights movement, people had seen everything that was going on as an unrest. They were like, these Black people are creating a chaos and we need to deal with it. So Nixon like went on this platform called the law and order rhetoric, meaning that we need to restore law and order into this land because of after what happened. So by using this type of terminology, he was mobilizing white opposition to civil rights. And doing this, he equated Blackness to criminality. And this is important. I know it's a little bit abstract because this kindled a war on drugs. And so what happened was crack cocaine was discovered. There's a lot of research on how it was planted, but I'm not trying to get like, what's it called? You know what I'm talking about. So we'll just say it was there already. Crack cocaine was found in urban ghettos. And so they made it so that the media and the popular people would become afraid, and they would associate Black people with use and criminality. And this, you talk now and you're like, yeah, people think that. Well, this started in 1901 because of Nixon. And this one like psychological tactic instigated one of the biggest racial cascade effects. And so here's a quote actually that I'd like to read for you guys first before we get into the details. This is the advisor to Nixon that's reading this. He says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and the Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this started, sorry, you guys are in the way, I'm trying to move you. This started a series of laws and acts that stayed forever, that started to kind of make this happen legitimately. So that was Nixon that started the war on drugs and was using it as his popular platform. Now you have President Reagan in 1984, did the Sentencing Reform Act. And what this did was, it was the tough on crime mentality, which means that like we need to give everyone like bad sentencing when you get arrested and all these things, because it needs to be consistent and we need to be tough on crime. And this was really like not beneficial because media was already depicting young Black males as the source for spreading violence and drugs. So it basically means we need to be tougher on the young Black males, maybe then they'll stop being criminals, type of thing. Then you have 2 years and 4 years later, the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts. And these ones, the first one established mandatory minimums, which basically means if you get caught on a drug possession or drug act, which that in itself there's a lot into that, then you have a minimum of 5 to 10 years in prison right off the bat. It used to be maximum 1 year, and then they instantly turned it into minimum 5 to 10 years for possession. And they also did something called the 100-to-1 ratio, which what that did was it punished crack cocaine 100 times worse than powder cocaine. And the reasoning behind this is because powder cocaine is more potent, so therefore crack cocaine, like we need to be like equal. We are equal. The problem is, even though whites and Blacks use cocaine at the same rates statistically, Black people use crack cocaine more and white people use powder cocaine more. And this was something that was known. This isn't like oops, we just found out. This is something that was known. So what this act did basically was it punished Black people for possession or of cocaine than white people, and it made them stay in prison exponentially longer than they would have in the first place. This is law, guys. This is you can't beat around the bush on this one. Okay, then you have 1994. Like Kika, I'm pretty sure you were born. All right, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. This act was written by Joe Biden. It was put into place during the Clinton administration, and one of the people that voted yes for it was Bernie Sanders. So politicians are always playing a nasty game. And this was the largest crime bill in the history of this country. And what it basically did was the 3 strikes you're out mentality, which basically means if you got three strikes of possession, which is just like, oh, someone found you and they found something in your pocket, there you go to prison. You get 3 strikes, you have a life sentence in prison. It could be something as simple as possession. And there were other things that it did that was also really harmful, including it stopped covering education for inmates in prison too. So it just sent people in there to die. Well, actually not to die, I'll tell you what it was. Oh, a few more things. We're not gonna go over this, but I included 2 slides in case you wanted to compare drug response once there's a white face to it. So you have the opioid epidemic, which is known to only to heavily affect white communities, and how it changed into, instead of tough on crime, being smart on crime and sending people into rehab. And then you also have the marijuana business, which was heavily criminalized and still is. But then once it was legalized, you still have Black people in prison for it, and it was their business, but now they're no longer allowed to have this business because they have a felony, and now it's a white business. And so there's a lot of information in that on how a white face can change the war on drugs, so to speak. This is something I'm really good with my eyes. So this is a really good visualization of male incarceration rates over time. So you have, I'm assuming you guys can see my cursor. It's pretty much stagnant. Then you have right here in 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs, and you have a solid increase of imprisonment during the time. And alongside, I added these. You have the Sentencing Reform Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. So this is tough on crime and mandatory minimum, and the 100 ratio. and the Violent Crime Act, which is the 3 strikes and you're out. So all of these bills and acts are like stacking up on top of each other to ensure a constant and steady flow into prisons. Now here's some stats for you guys before we get into prisons. Black people make up 13% of America's population, but they make up 40% of our prisons. And if you actually want to dive in deep into that, it's Black males tend to be. They make up 6.5% of the population, something like 30% of our prisons. And the United States of America as a whole, all of us are 4% of the world's population, but our prisons are 25% of the world's prisons. So if that, like, I could leave right now and that should say enough to you guys already. But don't worry, we're gonna get into it. Mass incarceration. This is what I like to call modern slavery. And the point of the game here is crime equals capital. And if you're not familiar with them, at least our country does. So the prison industrial complex. This is an intersection, which means it's a joining of government, policing, and private corporations. Because America, we are one of the only countries in the world that has a for-profit prison system. That means every single bed that is filled in America brings in money into people's pockets. And that creates incentive because you have wealthy people who are profiting off of this. So that gives them incentive to want this to keep going. So then they push for harsh laws and they want more sentencing because they want the beds to be filled because they're making money off of this. And what this is doing now is creating a labor force, because what do? People who are in prison are mandated to work, and they're working for like 19 cents on average an hour, but they're raking in millions of dollars. This is really similar to, remember how we talked about the black codes? They would arrest people for ridiculous things, and then they'd make them go work back in the plantations where they were working in before they were freed, to make money for the owners. Drugs, ridiculous rates, and then forcing them to work to bring money to people. So we're no better than we were like 100 years ago. And if the people refuse to work in the prisons, then so they crack, or they refuse them to have any family time. So they psychologically torture them until they have to work. And the prison is estimated to be around $87 billion worth. With 2.3 million people in prison, each of them are valued between $6,000 each, like revenue. And these American Airlines, Victoria's Secret, and Starbucks. And to drive the point for more, here's some stats. You have will go to prison versus 1 in 17. 73% of prisons of those are black. And since 1970, since when Nixon put the war on drugs, the US prison population grew 728.9% more, than the nation's population. And 97% of those have never had a trial. This is another, I didn't make this one, but this is an image that my friend made and posted that I think really portrays things very well on how slavery wasn't ended, it was just rebranded. So you have slavery for 246 years, then you have 8 years, slapping with just 34 years of redlining, incarceration. All this led up to Trayvon Martin, which I think a lot of us have probably heard about. In 2012, Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old boy. He was just walking home from, let's say, Cambridge, right? Just walking home from a convenience store. Someone who was just like a neighborhood watch person, whatever that means, was walking around, and they thought that he looked suspicious because he was wearing a hood and he had something in his pockets. He shot him, and all that Trayvon had was some Skittles and Arizona, which is like that iced tea drink. That's it. And the person that killed him was found not guilty. And when this happened, this is his death. Amongst there have been thousands before and thousands after, is what sparked what we know as the Black Lives Matter organization and movement. And Trayvon Martin has been the face of this from the beginning. So I know I just covered a lot, and I hope that you guys go back and read it at some point. I am going to super briefly discuss how systemic racism still exists today, like today, June 19, 2020. All right, there's several examples. Some of them are mass incarceration, like we just talked about, when you have so many people in prison, systematically put into prison so that you can profit off of their work. We have healthcare disparities, barriers to employment, law enforcement, education, a high cities, and we said no good, don't invest in these areas because Black people live here. Well, that ended, and what replaced it was something called gentrification, which I think many of us might be familiar with. And basically what gentrification is it's urban renewal. So what they did was they took these red line areas and they're like, you know what, let's make them pretty. Let's redevelop them so we can attract wealth to come in. So what they did was they started building luxury condos and all of these things to start to attract wealthy white residents to come and live in these red line areas. But the problem of what happened doing this is that by doing that, you're increasing the cost of living in these red line areas so that the Black people who already lived in these areas that are in dismal conditions because the government hasn't been investing in them suddenly can no longer in their own homes, and they get displaced and they have to somehow move somewhere else. And at the same time, for those who did stay, when you have all these luxury condos coming up filled with a lot of primarily wealthy white residents, they look around, they see the ghetto, and they see Black people around, and they feel uncomfortable. They're like, this place is unsafe. So the way to make these people feel comfortable is you increase police presence. Duh, right? But what happens? The police get called on for random things, just like Trayvon Martin, who looked apparently sketchy wearing a hood, walking across the street. The police get called on the Black people who lived in that community, and they get in prison. They get in the whole cycle. So that's gentrification. That's happening now. Actually, Boston is one of the best at gentrification. The aftermath of redlining is you have decades and decades of communities that have no funding. So it's underdeveloped, underfunded, underinvested, overpoliced, and because of that, you have poor education, which we'll talk about, I think, in the next slide. And there is no generational wealth. Generational wealth means, I know most of us are immigrants, so this might not be something that we like super relate to, but usually the wealth comes down from Giddo and from your dad. Wealth accumulates and comes down. They don't have this, and the wealth is repeatedly erased throughout history. And this lack of generational wealth is the primary cause of the racial wealth gap that we feel now, because Black people right now hold 3% of America's wealth, even though they hold 13% of our population. And this is directly also linked to redlining is education. There's something called property tax, which we might not be familiar with. Property tax is basically on which city or which town you live in, and that price tag that's put on you is correlated to the price or the value of that city. So let's put some random numbers. Let's say I live in Foxborough. If I live in Foxborough, I'll be worth $6,000. And let's say I live in Quincy or Brockton, then I could be worth $1,000. You get what I'm saying? So my price tag varies depending on where I live. This is important that follows me to my school. So if I go to Foxborough, I'm bringing $6,000 with me to Foxborough High, and then Foxborough High has money to make sure my education is great. But if I go to Brockton, I'm worth $1,000, so I'm only bringing $1,000 to Brockton High. So this ultimately means schools are underfunded in redline areas, which increases crime. And you have a bunch of stats you can read on. Are 3 times more. At the same time, schools are over policed. You have police just chilling in schools, and they handle things that are we handle. So you have things that would normally end up in a detention, ends up in like an arrest or a expulsion from school. And this is a real stat. 106 million kids in America attend school with police, but no school counselor. This shows you where our money is being spent. You have police, and like we talked about, how it started as slave patrols, and they went into enforcing Black codes, into enforcing Jim Crow laws, and then eventually into pumping people into the prisons with the war on drugs. But you also have excessive police presence in communities of color, and you have a lot of laws that allow this to happen. For example, there's something called stop and frisk, which is in a lot of places, but it's very popularly in New York, which basically means if you look suspicious, I can stop you and see what's up, which basically means I don't like the way you look, I'm going to find a reason to get you in trouble. And there's a lot of other stuff like that too. And at the same time, there's things like qualified If a police messes up, sucks. Nothing's gonna happen about it. This is a quote that I also like. It says, "American police was never designed as a deterrent to crime, but rather as a symbol of white comfort and minority suppression." And here are some more stats. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police, to be denied bail. They receive 25% longer sentences, and let me read this one fully. This statistic came out 2 weeks ago. Black people accounted for 70% of the police stops in Boston in this past year. And I think this is the last one, healthcare. There's a lot of stats like that book that I talked about. If you control for everything, control means that like you keep all of these aspects the same, so you're only comparing people with the exact same like scenarios in their life. You control for their age, their gender, their marital status, their environment, and their employment, and their insurance. Black people have worse health outcomes in every single category. For example, I'm sorry, I need to move you guys again. Their average lifespan is 6 years less. A Black woman is 22% more likely to die from heart disease and 71% more likely to die from cervical cancer. A Black woman is 200 and Black adults are 40% more likely to have high blood pressure and 60% more likely to have diabetes. This is stuff that's like, oh, we're not going to think like people back in Tuskegee or like, oh, Black people. That healthcare has been the point out of all this, and I hope you guys can go back and read this with some tea, is that this is embedded in every facet of our country, and the country was built on the abuse of Black bodies. And I think that it's really important to understand this so that we can catalyze change. We can't, it's really easy to be like, oh my God, Black Lives Matter, like hashtag woke for 2 weeks, and then move on, because that was a media movement which we're so used to following. Like, and like paying attention to it. And I think that the way that we can understand is when we see the history. This is, so I'm not going to read all of these, say the names out of respect, and if you want to important person in this story. Trayvon Martin, the one that started Black Lives Matter because holding Skittles in Arizona. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Plus the thousands that are unnamed. May they rest in peace. That's everything. I'm going to send you guys the link to this presentation, and then I'm also sending you guys this link as it loads. I think I have it loaded here. Oh, my Wi-Fi is so good. This is a document I have that has resources on, like, basically to understand the Black disparity as it states. You have books, articles and websites, you have podcasts, movies and videos, and ways to support. So this is like, whatever your preference, this is the way to go. So I hope that that's helpful for you. I'm going to stop screen recording now so I can copy and paste this into the comments for you guys.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a lot to take in, but that is so helpful. Do we have time, Natalie, for questions? If anyone wants questions, are you able to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best to respond, but no promises.
Sweet. Well, if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you really want, you can put it in the chat. I think Natalie Sorial is asking you to clean out your inbox.
That was so good. But I guess I could think of a question. You know how you said like redlining like is like starting to come back and happen in like neighborhoods? Would you say any of the neighborhoods in Massachusetts, like would Dorchester be like an example of that?
So redlining ended, I think in the 70s, but but the effects of it, like, because legally they made something that made it illegal, but the effects of it are still the same because the communities have been established. So Dorchester is actually an example of gentrification. I don't know if you've seen those like luxury like mall and condos and stuff, but Dorchester is an example of gentrification, which is when we talked about when you put super wealthy things into communities that what they needed was financial support, not buildings and stuff. So redlining has stopped, but the effects still happen.
A lot of what's happening in Boston too is like people don't have the, like Natalie mentioned, the capital, like the money from being passed down to buy property. So when people come in and buy, then they're kind of like forced out and don't have anywhere to buy houses. So something cool, just like a cool story, I guess, with that was, I know this white woman who bought property in Dorchester actually and lived there for a while and just sold it to another woman that I know who's Black, but the same price that she bought it at years ago, so that now she's giving this woman like a chance to have money for her family and her future as she continues to grow and build. So it's just like one way that that woman saw like God asking her to do that, I guess. It was like a cool story. But yeah, it's happening like all over Boston.
Natalie, what do you think right now, like with the health crisis and all the things that you were showing about like how Black people are just statistically way more vulnerable than white people? What do you think are some of the major reasons that is happening right now?
Honestly, this is just my opinion. A case, it was a clear bias from a physician or healthcare provider that ended up in the hurt of the type of care that could be given. And those stories, rightfully so, are spread within the community because obviously they're trying to look out for each other. So that's in my opinion. I think it's primarily, actually it's a few things. It's a one-on-one basis of bias train check. And then it's another thing of actually, I think med schools are just hopping on this now, but still not to the extent we need to be. They don't teach things on Black bodies. So for example, you learn what like certain rashes look like on white skin, but not on Black skin. So by the time that it's caught, it's because it's really bad and very blatant type of thing. So it's a mixture of education. We need to learn how to recognize things on different skin types, on different body types, in different ages, and all these things. And then it's a mix of inner bias where like the physicians can there's a very long history actually of it being assumed that Black people have a higher pain tolerance than white people, and there's still residuals of that now because of way too many things to talk about right now. So there's a really common thing of like a physician be biased. You have a Black person and really pain the drugs. Do you know what I'm saying? And many people in every race, that it's true they are coming for drugs, but a lot of times it's just bias. So
my biggest question is why don't you think that this in school, and this is open to anyone to answer, but I feel like it's important to kind of know this because I feel like our education system is biased if that's the case, you know what I mean? Like I just feel like our society has just been like they don't teach the people that, and I feel like that's a big and because they're kind of like go.
I can give my answer and then anyone else can jump in. I think in general, our history is very whitewashed. It's not just against Black communities, it's against Native American communities, it's against the Italian community. Have been washed out. The writers is to portray like the white America as like the successors and the kind and all these things. That would be my answer. And unfortunately, actually, it's not just America that does this. I think I don't know to the extent, like I can't compare to the extent, but I know like every single country around the world has their own version of how history happens. The best example I can think of that blew my mind was the 6-Day War that happened between Israel and Egypt. Egypt teaches that and Israel teaches they want it. Things like that. So every country has their own bias towards history, but I do think it's our duty to find out what really
Like,
happened. Anyone else can answer if they haven't. Yeah.
I agree with that, but I think